Our next speaker is Vicky from Warwick University. She's going to present the hidden curriculum in an immigrant's kitchen cupboard. Vicky is a final year PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research looks into the material culture of memory and identity among Arabic speakers in the UK. Hi Vicky, so if you can share your screen.
Hello. Okay, so hi everyone. First off, I'd like to apologize for not being there in person. I was planning on doing so, but I got notified yesterday that all the trains from the Midlands to Liverpool had been cancelled, so I wasn't able to join in person. A lot of this presentation was initially designed around playing with some of the objects, so I wanted to bring the objects so that we can interact with them. I will try to do some of that online, but yeah, just letting you know that I had kind of a different approach in the beginning. But I still want to unpack some of the implications of how in my project food has become kind of an hidden curriculum or an informal pedagogy. It's become much of an educational moment. So I want to go over a brief project overview to walk you through some of the research I've been doing in the past couple of years. Then I want to look at the point in time where it becomes a political question, so a question of political identity. Then I've kind of broken it down into two case studies. So one of them follows a specific food item, and the second one follows the pot in which food is cooked. So I'm looking at food and also food production in that sense. Most of my work is around remembering and memory and identity formation. So it's very much in line with the major questions that you've been discussing this morning. So I'm very happy with that in that sense that the overlap of thematic alignment is very much there. I kind of want to conclude with a question on how to think of food as a pedagogical moment in time, especially for immigrant community members. So I have written a big chunk of this that has gone into my PhD. However, I'm also extending it into a different argument that I'm hoping to take a bit further and explore it in a bit more depth. When I started the PhD, food was not in my research questions. It was not something I was intending on finding, but it eventually just, when you talk about memory, I think Alisa spoke about this right, like half an hour ago as well. The minute you bring up memory, food is inherently part of that discussion, and it was a very interesting and a very lovely medium through which I could unpack some of the memories of my participants. So it inevitably became a very big part of my research, even though I did not anticipate it when I first went into the field. So to give you a very brief overview of my project and what I've been working on, the main questions or the main points of curiosity on my end were about what objects remind Arabic speakers of home. So how do people associate a sense of home through material culture? I'm very much coming into this from a social anthropology perspective. So the follow-up questions I was interested in was how do people inherit the notion of home through objects? How is it passed down from first-generation immigrants to second generation to third generation? How is this changing when people come from war and conflict zones compared to those who immigrate as skilled workers, for example? And the final question was, where are these objects situated in the everydayness of life in the UK as an Arabic speaker? The context is very important. I started field work around the second half of 2023, going into 2024. It's very much a time of political turmoil. So the community that I am part of, by the way, and the community that I was working with, it became an insider research project. It became a project that was more so about trying to understand what does it mean to be an Arabic speaker in the UK right now in the current political climate. Methodologically, I tried to approach this as creatively as possible. I didn't want to put people in a position where they felt like they had to talk about things that are actively politically worrying them. So there were two main branches of methodology that I was interested in. I still am interested in. The first one is trauma-informed research methods. So it's very much focusing on ensuring that participants feel like they have the space to unpack sensitive subjects and sensitive topics. And the second one was feminist creative methods. So in my research design, the way in which both of these things came together was through pottery workshops. What I did is that I curated spaces where people who were Arabic-speaking immigrants and second and third generation Arabic speakers in the UK, they could come together in groups, and we ran a total of 4 pottery workshops. So it was a full afternoon. You would come in, you would learn the very basics of how to handle clay and what to do with clay. And then the main prompt for people was to make an object that reminds you of home. So you made replicas of the objects instead of the actual thing in itself. And this is where a lot of food came into play. As I said in the beginning, I was not intending on writing a PhD about food or trying to unpack the role of food. But one of the main things that people made were food items, either food items that they remembered or food items that they were told about, but they couldn't physically access in the UK. So I'm thinking of people who were from war zones who didn't have direct access to those spaces. I initially did a pilot workshop with a diverse set of international immigrants rather than only Arabic-speaking ones, just to check if the pottery method would work. I wanted to test it on different groups of participants to see, and it was very interesting because my pilot workshop had 17 participants, and more than half of them made different versions of food, which again was not prompted. But in retrospect, it is something that kind of started the food conversation for me. It started getting me interested in how and why we consider food as one of the stable means of remembering and memory making, and also inheriting. Inheriting as in inheriting the memory of a space or an identity. So in total, I'm working with over 100 objects. I've tried to group some of the food items that were repeated. So in this presentation, I will specifically talk about the food items that were repeated multiple times by different groups of people who did not know each other. So I found that quite fascinating. And there is a very interesting train of thought that emerged based on those conversations of why people associate a certain region or a certain space with one specific kind of bread, for example. So before I go into the specifics of the case study, I kind of want to talk about what I mean by politicizing the cuisine, how I think of it as a political educational tool. The first one is obviously the context and the temporality and the polarity of being an Arabic speaker in the UK, the way in which people navigate their identity as one that is becoming inherently politicized, and it's just part of everyday life, and it has to be learned and navigated. This specifically for first generation asylum seekers and immigrants who are in the early stages of residency in the UK. This was an ongoing conversation that we needed to have during those workshops, which was, how do you navigate being in this space? What are the implications of being in this space? And also, what are ways in which you can connect your current space with an idea of home? When I say home, I mean it in a very broad sense, because there's enough feminist literature in this explaining that home does not necessarily have to be a fluffy, fuzzy feeling that we associate with a sense of comfort, but rather a feeling that's drenched in nostalgia. And a lot of the time, it's drenched in different layers of lived experience as well. So it's a bit bittersweet. The second way in which food came out as like an identity politics thing was its association with flagging identity or flagging solidarity. We see a lot of this that has emerged how people associate, for example, watermelons as a signal, like as a flagging element of solidarity. So it's very much thinking of the different elements that go into thinking of identity in relation to food, and how that just becomes a political statement when it's socially agreed upon. I try to conceptualize these from a pedagogical lens, from thinking of them as an informal pedagogy that turns into a sense of a teaching moment, especially when looking at second and third generation immigrants and their children. For me, it was very much about the question of how do you learn to perform being an Arabic speaker? What are the implications of it? How does it become a teaching method that you are actively inheriting and putting into your everyday life? Where does it fit? How do you negotiate it? Considering that it's a political thing, how and why do you actively choose to embody this practice? So I came into this with a lot more questions than answers. I want to try to unpack some of this based on the two of the case studies I initially mentioned. So the first one is a bread, a piece of bread. So this bread is very much known in the Levant as kak. Some of you might be familiar with it. Different regions have different variations of it, but it's basically a bread that you can buy on the street. You can buy it in most public spaces. It's very affordable, and more often than not, you can get different fillings in it. So you can choose based on if you want a spice mix in it or if you want cheese in it. And all of those go back into different social dynamics. So I did not go into workshops thinking that the minute I give people a piece of clay, they're going to make me different variations of bread. But when I came to analyze the data that I had collected, there were so many different versions of this exact same bread that it ended up being almost half a chapter of my PhD. So to me, this piece of bread is very interesting, and I've only put one image of one of the clay versions of a participant because she wrote a very specific description of it. So participants were also told that if you want to, you can write a description of it as well. And this one participant, she wrote that it reminds her of a sense of Sunday morning. For her, it was a spatial experience. It was going to the streets of Beirut with her grandmother. And she said here, and I quote directly, it feels like community. And I found that phrase very interesting, to think of a piece of bread as an immigrant in your mid-30s in London, to remember and reminisce a piece of bread as a sense of community, as a sense of relational identity, as something you associate with your grandmother, but also associate with an active space. So it led us into a conversation of thinking through this specific food piece and thinking of its implications. One of the main questions that emerged was, how do people access this food? So one of the main ways that I used to get kak when I was still in Beirut was through the picture you see on the right, which are usually immigrant men who have this very precarious job of riding bikes around the city center delivering bread. They're very much part of the ecosystem, but it's based on a precarious immigrant labor. However, you can tell a lot about the situation of the country and also the class dynamics just by looking at this one image, because the minute there is some kind of conflict or there is some kind of instability in terms of how immigrant workers are treated, this specific image is in Beirut, so how immigrant workers are treated in Beirut, you get far less access to kak that week. And this is a conversation we were having in that workshop, is to what extent you associate your access to bread with whether or not there is political stability enough for immigrant men to be on the streets selling this bread, and how that is associated with not just gender dynamics, but also a question of class, a question of accessibility, a question of safeguarding lives and jobs of people. So the kak that started off as this very cute memory of an idea of a Sunday morning with your grandmother, it turned into very much of a political statement in trying to understand how we learn to decode what's happening in spaces around us, especially spaces that are active conflict zones. So how can we tell whether the situation in the country is stable enough? How can we tell whether we have access to certain ingredients and not necessarily others? So it's very much, the bread became very much a starting point to unpacking some of these huge sociological themes that I went into the PhD wanting to understand. It started off as a material culture project. It very much turned into a project that looks at food in the sense that it became one of the main ways in which people felt comfortable talking about home and identity and their associations with this notion of space and place. This to me raises a lot of questions in terms of gender as well. So when trying to write about calc, one of the ways in which I write about it is trying to think of the gendered elements involved within it. So the placard I use here in the picture is one that talks about how it's associated with going to a public space with a grandmother figure. And that was very repetitive. That was a theme that became such a huge part that I tried to unpack it individually, where people were associating certain kinds of food with public sphere versus private sphere. And it was the kind of public sphere that is very much gendered. I tried to compare this to experiences I've had with participants who made things like ashtrays, for example. I know it's not directly related to food, but it's an example that might help you kind of get the picture that I'm trying to paint. So a lot of participants also made ashtrays. And when I asked them why, they said it's because they associate a sense of smoking in public and that communal act of smoking together with a sense of being back home. So to me, that was quite fascinating. It goes back to this whole element of who gets the right to be in a public space, who gets the right to smoke in public, who gets the right to have these cute, whimsical memories with their grandmothers compared to those who are on the other end of this. So the whole conversation about private and public and space making through food raised different layers of sociological questions for me that I tried to look into while having these conversations. However, one thing that actively came up is that people were predominantly very keen on remembering the very good side of things. There was very few mentions of the bad side of it. There was actively the term used in Middle Eastern literature to talk about this is amnesia. So there was this cultural amnesia of let's not talk about those weeks where we don't have access to this bread. Let's not talk about the conflict that doesn't allow people to sell this bread, but rather let's talk about those few Sundays where you do have access to it. And to me, that was very interesting because it totally reframes the way you're remembering. You're remembering through food, but you're selectively remembering instances that are not contaminated by different layers of lived experience. And it was really interesting to trace this across people who have had that memory firsthand. So this was very much conversations to be had with first-generation immigrants. It was a very different experience when I tried to have these conversations with second and third generation immigrants. For people who were born and raised in the UK, but who had inherited certain ideas of identity and home and politics through the notion of food, which brings me to my second case study. The second case study is a tagine. It's quite a stereotypical thing to choose, I know, and it's been very interesting to try and unpack because very different countries claim ownership of it, and there's the whole ethnic dispute around it as well, which I find quite fascinating. But it raises a lot of important questions of how people remember and how people inherit the act of remembering, because a lot of the people I spoke to who were second and third generation, they did have a tagine, but they only remember it based on specific festivals or holidays or specific moments in time where their family was inclined to use it. It was not part of everyday life for them. It was very much an act of celebration. So there is a huge dissonance between the first generation person remembering a Sunday compared to someone remembering an act of celebration where there was an attempt at recreating a sense of home through food. So that's why I find the tagine quite interesting. Again, I ended up with way too many tagines in my when I was speaking to my participants. Some people made it with food in it, some people made it without food. The image I've included here is a clay version that was made with some food in it. I think it was supposed to be lamb. The description of it was quite fascinating to me because basically the person who made it wrote, I made a tagine because Morocco to me means eating good food, cooked with love by my mom. And I focus specifically on this element of by my mom because it paints the picture of how it's very much a gendered learning experience. There is a gendered element in who gets to teach how to use a tagine versus who gets to learn how to use a tagine versus who just gets to eat from a tagine. So to me, this raised so many different questions of celebrating being from a specific place, how that celebration functions in a personal space, in a private space like a kitchen, and how that specifically functions a few times per year compared to the first-hand experience of a first-generation immigrant, which is substantially different. So it was inheriting a certain political identity, or identity politics, if you want to go down that route, through the act of cooking or through the act of using the pot for cooking. Now, to me, the tagine is a very interesting example because the different tagines I had very different backstories. But the alignment through all was this sense of, oh, it's from my mom or it's from my grandmother. There was this very much role of care and responsibility being put on the people who are doing the labor of making food. There is ample literature on this. It's very much ingrained in our understanding of labor and gendered labor. But to me, this idea of who gets to inherit the responsibility of learning how to use a tagine was very interesting. I tried to ask multiple people about how they associate the tagine with a sense of responsibility of learning how to perform using it. So the skills involved in knowing how to cook, the skills involved in sustaining the recipes, so finding the proper ingredients for it, and also the skills involved in knowing who to share it with. So there is a lot of cultural discourse around this is appropriate for this specific celebration, but not that one. So I was very much interested in how people learn these things, how they inherit it as cultural capital when they are second or third generation immigrants who are being born and raised in a cultural setting that does not necessarily highlight their identity. They're very much identifying as Londoners. They're very much living an isolated UK experience. They're not in direct contact. Most of the people I spoke to don't have any direct ties or access ways of going back home. That's not a common thing for them. However, the main way in which they chose to access it or talk about accessing it was through food, whether it was the pot through which the food was cooked or the food itself. Now, to me, this has been a discussion that's very much happening in a private sphere. It's happening within that confined kitchen setting. It's happening in a familial setting. So I was curious about how this translates into a learning moment that is a bit more neoliberal. So the question that emerges for me here is one that thinks through how we conceptualize food as a standardized way of understanding. There's quite a bit written about this whole idea of ethnic food, of food being food recipes being diluted or being standardized in order to meet the requirements of different markets. So it's very much a neoliberal question that looks at the pedagogical apprehensions of food from a totally different angle. Here, for example, I put this sign because I found it quite fascinating that it's the best falafel in town, and every person I've met in the UK who sells falafel says that it's the best falafel in town. And I find it quite interesting because they're using substantially different recipes. They're referring to different understanding of falafel. The Egyptian falafel is fundamentally different than the Lebanese falafel. However, there's still this argument of it's the best falafel in town. So to me, that's very much a neoliberal question. It's very much a question of standardization. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, I can argue both ways. There is a very long pros and cons list about what it means for an immigrant for their food to be standardized and neoliberalized. It does create some sense of awareness and some sense of showing people who Arabic speakers are vis-a-vis their food instead of other aspects of their identity. But it also creates a sense of standardization that loses those implications of personal heritage and personal identity and personal recipe. So those regional derivatives eventually get lost in all of the modes of standardization. So the neoliberal question was something that emerged kind of organically for me, but I still haven't formalized whether or not I am totally with or against it, because I feel like there is possibility of going both ways, especially in the current political climate. I think food is a very interesting ways in which we can talk about identity politics. And if allowing more people to standardize foods gives those people access to said food, then I do not know whether or not that is a negative thing. So it's been an ongoing question. I would love it if some of you have any thoughts about this, then maybe we can discuss it during the Q&A. But it's been an active thing that has been in the back of my head that I've been trying to unpack about what happens to food the minute it enters this public sphere, when it's no longer within a kitchen, when it's no longer a grandmother passing it down to their daughter and forcing this sense of responsibilitization onto them. So what happens the minute we flip the script in terms of labor and responsibility and also national or heritage identity based on food? Which leads me to the pedagogical question, right? All of this is about a hidden curriculum. It's about a way of teaching and learning how to perform certain ways of identity. So I ended up with several questions that, as I said, I'm still trying to unpack as an extension of the PhD at this point. The first part for me is, who is the hidden curriculum hidden from? We know very clearly that there are people in communities who are gendered and seen as the carriers of the quote unquote burden or quote unquote the privilege of knowing how to cook or for whom to cook or when to cook. So all of the implications that this curriculum is very much a learned thing. It's very actively a pedagogical tool. However, it raises several layers of concern the minute we isolate it from the private sphere and think of it more in terms of a public sphere as well. So the question then emerges of, how does food carry the ability to educate? How can we use food as a starting point to have more in-depth conversations about identity politics and belonging? What are the political implications of doing so? So what is it, how is it any different than talking to a first-generation immigrant compared to a second or a third-generation immigrant? How is their inheriting this food practice enabling them to live a different experience of being an Arabic speaker in the UK? Does it enable a sense of belonging or not necessarily? Or is that a good thing? Is that something they would want or not really? So what happens to the food narrative when it gets disrupted by the sociopolitical context, but also by neoliberal standardization? So those are two main frames of thought that I've been trying to work through. The concluding question is, how do we conceptualize the practice of food as both critically inherent to identity politics, but also being mindful that it propagates a certain sense of tradition, a certain sense of responsibility? I don't mean responsibility in a negative sense, but rather some people do consider it a privilege to have the responsibility to have access to those recipes. But to me, it's always been a question of polarity. So all of these questions, I feel like there are three different ways to approach them. The first one is from the perspective of the teacher, the person who knows how to cook and is teaching it to someone else. That is substantially different than the experience of the learner. So the second and the third generation people I spoke to, especially the young women, there was very much this act of learning how to be a proper, Arab woman who can cook certain things, how to handle a tagine, for instance. So these two situations are substantially different than the minute it enters the public sphere, because within the public, it's a very different understanding of Arabic food. It's a very different understanding of Levantine cuisine, of what it means to say that the falafel is Lebanese compared to falafel being Egyptian. It's the very small detail that makes a substantial difference in how other people experience your culture, especially at the point in time where there is a lot going on in the politics about Arabic speakers. So the minute you approach all of that political dimension through a very simple food element like the falafel, it kind of disrupts the whole narrative of identity politics being within a certain realm compared to food being in a totally different realm. For me, the main thing I got from this, from trying to unpack food as material culture, was this minute in time where it becomes an active pedagogical tool, not just for the people within the community, but also for the people outside the community. And that thin line between being an Arabic speaker or not necessarily, food was a way in which some of that was bridged. This is not like an ultimate solution. It was not a utopian solution to having more conversations and having more conversations that were easier to navigate, but food was one of the main starting points to sustain that sensitive subject, to sustain that sensitive questioning of a political moment, of a political experience, of a lived experience of being an immigrant in the UK. So for me, food was one of the inevitable things that emerged, and I was very happy with how it turned into a collective experience of sharing different apprehensions of it. So different versions of bread that we associate with a sense of home, that we associate with a sense of space, sense of access, and also the people involved in making and sustaining that access, whether it's the figure of a grandmother or it's the figure of an immigrant worker who used to deliver those breads, for example. So I think I'm out of time, so I will just conclude with that thought process. I would very much appreciate it if we can continue having this conversation. As I said, I'm still trying to develop this into potentially an extension of the PhD and seeing where it goes from there. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Vicky, for the very nice presentation. As an immigrant, also, I find it very touching, some of the objects, some of the things that you spoke about, like the smoke, because I think I'm coming from Istanbul and I think it's a very similar geography. So it's just also the bread and everything. So like street selling bread on the street. So all of those, like it evoked my memory. So I thought about how food is evoking the traumas of displacement and also healing. It's
Yeah.
two mechanism probably, yeah. Yeah. Any questions? Thank you so much, Vicky. There are no questions now.
Oh, that's perfect. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm sorry I couldn't join in person. I was really looking forward to it, but
yeah, I hope we meet in a different occasion. I hope we want to continue these connections, so probably we will meet again.
yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.